Tonight we begin with a warning that many people in Washington may not want to hear. A direct war between the United States and Iran would not look like the clean, short, high-tech campaign that its supporters might try to sell to the American public. It would not simply be a matter of American aircraft flying over Iran, destroying missile sites, disabling radar systems, and forcing Tehran to surrender. It would not be Iraq in 2003, it would not be a quick television war, and if the United States ever crosses the line from airstrikes into a real ground invasion, the consequences could be catastrophic, not only for Iran, not only for the Middle East, but for the future of American power itself. To understand why, we have to look beyond the headlines and examine the forces pushing this confrontation forward. Because wars rarely happen because of one reason. They happen when different groups with different goals all begin moving in the same direction, even if they are not seeking the same final outcome. And in the case of Iran, several powerful forces are already aligned toward escalation. The first is the pro-Israel political network inside the United States. For decades, Iran has been viewed by Israel and its supporters as the central strategic threat in the Middle East. Tehran supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and a wider network of armed groups across the region. From Israel's point of view, Iran is not just another hostile state. It is the center of an entire regional system designed to pressure Israel from multiple directions. That is why any discussion of a US-Iran war cannot ignore Israeli security interests. Israel does not need to invade Iran itself if it can persuade Washington that Iran must be dealt with as a threat to global security. But Israel is only one part of the equation. Saudi Arabia has its own reasons for wanting Iran weakened. For Riyadh, Iran is not just a military threat, it is a civilizational rival, a religious rival, and a geopolitical rival. The Saudi-Iranian struggle has shaped conflicts across the Middle East for years in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and the Gulf. Saudi Arabia sees Iran as a force that challenges its influence, threatens its oil infrastructure, and undermines its claim to leadership in the Muslim world. So while Israel sees Iran as a security threat, Saudi Arabia sees Iran as a regional competitor that must eventually be contained, weakened, or broken. Then there is the third force, the American empire itself. The United States has spent decades building a global system in which American power is not only military, but financial. The dollar, Wall Street, energy routes, sanctions, military bases, and alliance networks all reinforce one another. America does not only project power because it has aircraft carriers. It projects power because the global order still depends heavily on systems Washington controls. But that also creates a dangerous addiction. When a country becomes used to dominating global events, it can begin to believe that every problem has a military solution. It can begin to mistake reach for control, it can mistake air superiority for victory, it can mistake the ability to destroy targets for the ability to govern outcomes. That is where the danger begins, because the modern American military has been shaped by the memory of fast, overwhelming campaigns, especially the early phases of the Iraq War. The shock and awe doctrine created the impression that the United States could use air power, special forces, satellites, drones, and precision weapons to break an enemy quickly and decisively. And on television, that kind of war looks unbeatable. Bombs hit their targets, buildings explode, radar systems go dark, generals give briefings, commentators talk about American dominance, viewers see maps, arrows, missile footage, an aircraft carrier launches. But war is not won on television, war is won through logistics, manpower, supply lines, political will, terrain, adaptation, and the enemy's willingness to keep fighting after the first wave of destruction. And this is where Iran becomes a nightmare scenario. Iran is not a small, flat country waiting to be overrun. It has a population of roughly 90 million people. It has mountains, deserts, cities, internal security forces, missile forces, naval assets, drones, militias, and deep historical experience with foreign interference. It is a country built to absorb pressure, disperse its forces, survive sanctions, and fight asymmetrically. Any American planner who assumes Iran can be broken quickly is walking into one of the oldest traps in military history, underestimating the defender. Now imagine how a future war could be sold to the American public. The president goes on television and delivers a major address. He says Iran is moving rapidly toward a nuclear weapon. He says US and Israeli intelligence have discovered new evidence. He says Iranian proxies are threatening global shipping. He says the Strait of Hormuz is at risk. He says American allies are under attack. He says the Iranian people are protesting and begging for freedom. He says the regime is unstable, brutal, and ready to collapse. Then comes the familiar promise. This will be limited. This will be decisive. This will protect democracy. This will protect global energy. This will protect America's allies. This will end quickly. And many Americans, exhausted by crisis, but still conditioned to believe in American military superiority, may accept the argument. At first, the war may even appear successful. American aircraft would likely dominate large parts of the sky. Iranian radar systems and missile sites would be hit. Naval forces would move into the Persian Gulf. Special forces might enter the country. Cyber attacks could target Iranian command systems. Israel and Saudi Arabia could support the campaign directly or indirectly. The media would show dramatic footage of explosions, carrier launches, and military briefings. For a few days, maybe even a few weeks, Washington could claim that the operation is working. But then comes the real question: what happens after the first wave? What happens when Iran does not collapse? What happens when the government survives? What happens when the Revolutionary Guard disperses instead of surrendering? What happens when the war leaves the air and enters the ground? That is the point where America's biggest advantage begins to weaken. Because air power can destroy, it cannot occupy, drones can strike, they cannot control territory. Special forces can raid, they cannot hold a country of 90 million people. And if Washington decides that airstrikes are not enough, if it decides that regime change requires ground forces, then the United States faces the problem that has destroyed armies throughout history. Logistics, getting troops into Iran would be difficult, keeping them alive would be much harder. Getting them out could become the real disaster. Iran's geography is one of its greatest defenses. Much of the country is mountainous. Roads, passes, supply corridors, and staging areas would become vulnerable. Armored formations would struggle in difficult terrain. Helicopters and transport aircraft could be targeted. Drones, missiles, mines, ambushes, and sabotage could turn every supply route into a battlefield. A force that looks powerful on a map could become trapped in reality. This is where traditional military doctrine matters. To win a major war, an army must do three basic things. It must mass enough force, it must avoid encirclement, it must protect supply lines. A US invasion of Iran could fail on all three. First, the United States would likely not have enough troops to conquer and control the country. Iran is too large, too populated, and too difficult to occupy with a limited expeditionary force. Sending 100,000 troops may sound massive on television, but against a country the size and complexity of Iran, it could be dangerously insufficient. Second, those troops could become surrounded by hostile terrain, hostile forces, and hostile populations. Even if they win initial battles, they may not control the surrounding environment. Third, supply lines would become the central vulnerability. Ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical evacuation, reinforcements, all of it would have to move through contested space. And the more American troops enter Iran, the more supplies they need. The larger the force becomes, the more vulnerable it becomes. That is the cruel paradox. Too few troops cannot win, too many troops cannot be supplied. Once they are inside, leaving may look like defeat. This is how a war becomes a trap. History gives us warnings. Ancient Athens learned this lesson in Sicily. During the Peloponnesian War, Athens was already locked in a brutal struggle with Sparta. Then Athenian leaders convinced themselves that launching a massive expedition to Sicily would expand their power, bring wealth, and shift the balance of the war. First, it seemed possible. Athens had ships, Athens had confidence, Athens had imperial ambition. But the expedition was far from home, the supply lines were fragile, the enemy adapted, the campaign became harder than expected. Eventually, the Athenian force was trapped and destroyed. The disaster weakened Athens so severely that it helped bring down the Athenian Empire. The lesson is simple. Powerful states often lose not because they are weak, but because they overestimate what power can do far from home. Vietnam offers another warning. At the beginning of the 1960s, many Americans barely knew where Vietnam was. By the end of the decade, hundreds of thousands of American troops were fighting there. The escalation happened gradually: advisors, trainers, limited commitments, combat troops, air campaigns, and then full-scale war. This is mission creep. A small commitment becomes a larger one, then the larger one becomes politically impossible to abandon. Leaders begin by asking, what do we need to win? But eventually they ask, how do we leave without looking defeated? That is the sunk cost fallacy. The more America invested in Vietnam, the harder it became to admit the war was unwinnable. Tens of thousands of American soldiers died, millions of Vietnamese died, but the US could not break the enemy's will to fight. That is the key point. Killing people is not the same as winning a war. Destroying infrastructure is not the same as destroying resistance. In fact, overwhelming violence can sometimes strengthen the enemy's will because every bomb creates more anger, more grief, more revenge, and more recruits. If Iran would likely understand this, the Iranian leadership knows it cannot defeat the United States in a conventional head-to-head war. It cannot match American aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, satellite systems, or global logistics. But it may not need to. Iran's strategy would likely be to survive the opening attack, avoid decisive destruction, draw American forces deeper into the country or the region, and then turn the conflict into a long war of attrition. The goal would not be to win quickly. The goal would be to make America bleed slowly. And this is where the Revolutionary Guard becomes central. For Iran's hardliners, a US invasion may not be the nightmare Washington imagines. It may be the scenario they have been preparing for. If American troops enter Iranian territory, Tehran can frame the conflict as a patriotic war, a religious war, and an anti-imperial war all at once. That would make it much harder for internal opposition groups to side openly with the United States. This is another mistake Washington often makes. American leaders may assume that because many Iranians dislike their government, they would welcome an American invasion. But that is a dangerous misunderstanding. People can oppose their government and still oppose foreign occupation. Iranians remember the 1953 coup. They remember US support for the Shah. They watched what happened in Iraq after 2003. They saw the destruction, the chaos, the house raids, the sectarian violence, the collapse of order, and the humiliation of occupation. So even Iranians who dislike the current regime may still reject an American invasion. That is nationalism, and nationalism is one of the most powerful forces in war. A foreign army often unites people who were divided the day before. That means Washington could enter Iran expecting a popular uprising only to trigger a national resistance. This is exactly the kind of miscalculation that turns regime change wars into disasters. The same problem appeared in Ukraine, though in a different form. The Russia-Ukraine war showed the importance of terrain, manpower, supply lines, and political image. It also showed how television narratives can distort battlefield reality. A leader can appear strong on camera while the military balance worsens. A country can win the information war while losing men, equipment, and strategic depth. And one of the central lessons from Ukraine is that modern war consumes resources at a terrifying rate. Artillery shells, missiles, drones, vehicles, air defenses, electronic warfare systems, all of it disappears quickly. That raises another major problem for the United States. Can America actually sustain a long industrial war? The United States has the most advanced military in the world, but much of its industrial base has weakened over decades of globalization. Manufacturing capacity has shifted abroad, supply chains are fragile, shipbuilding is slow. Weapons production cannot always match battlefield consumption. A short war may be manageable. A long war against a country like Iran, while also supporting other allies and deterring other rivals, could expose severe weaknesses. And America's rivals would be watching, China would watch, Russia would watch, every country frustrated with American dominance would watch. Failed US war in Iran would not just damage Washington in the Middle East, it would damage the image of American power globally. That is why this scenario is so dangerous, because once American prestige is on the line, leaders may escalate not because victory is likely, but because defeat is unacceptable. This is where game theory helps explain the trap. Each major player may want war, but for different reasons. The United States may want to topple the Iranian government and reassert dominance in the Middle East. Iran may want to lure the United States into a war it cannot win, then use the invasion to unite the population and bleed American power. Israel may want Iran's military capacity destroyed and its proxy network weakened. Saudi Arabia may want its biggest regional rival broken. But the best outcome for Israel and Saudi Arabia may not actually be a clean American victory. Their best outcome could be a war in which Iran is devastated and the United States becomes too exhausted to dominate the region afterward. In that scenario, Iran is weakened, America is weakened, and regional powers like Israel and Saudi Arabia gain more room to shape the Middle East. That does not mean every actor openly plans for disaster. But in geopolitics, countries often benefit from outcomes they would never admit publicly. This is the dark logic of power politics. The United States may think it is using regional allies to isolate Iran. But regional allies may also be using the United States to fight their most dangerous war for them. Meanwhile, Iran may be betting that America's greatest strength, its ability to project power, can be turned into a weakness. Get the Americans to enter, make them stay, make leaving look humiliating, make staying too expensive. That is how a battlefield becomes a black hole. Once tens of thousands of American troops are inside Iran, Washington faces impossible choices. Withdraw and admit failure, stay and bleed, send more troops and expand the trap, threaten escalation and risk a wider war. And this is where nuclear danger enters the picture. If an American president found U.S. forces trapped in Iran, he may try to regain leverage by threatening extreme escalation. The message to Tehran could be simple: allow safe passage or face overwhelming destruction. But Iran would not be alone in calculating its next move. Russia could step in diplomatically or militarily by warning against nuclear use. China could back Moscow politically. The entire crisis could move from a regional war to a global confrontation. At that point, Iran would no longer be only about Iran. It would become a test of the entire world order. Can the United States still impose its will? Can Russia block American escalation? Can China benefit from American overextension? Can the Middle East survive another great power conflict? And can the world prevent a regional war from becoming something far worse? This is why a US-Iran war is so dangerous. Not because America cannot bomb Iran, it can. Not because America cannot damage Iran. It absolutely can. The danger is that bombing is the easy part. The hard part is controlling what happens after. What happens when Iran retaliates through proxies? What happens when shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is threatened? What happens when oil prices spike? What happens when U.S. bases in Iraq, Syria, the Gulf, and beyond come under attack? What happens when Hezbollah enters the conflict? What happens when Israel responds harder? What happens when Saudi infrastructure becomes a target? What happens when American troops are hit? What happens when Washington has to choose between escalation and humiliation? This is how wars expand. Not always by design, sometimes by momentum. One strike leads to retaliation, retaliation leads to another strike. A limited operation becomes a regional campaign becomes a credibility test becomes a war leaders cannot afford to lose. And once that happens, strategy gives way to pride. That may be the most dangerous element of all. Great powers often lose wars not because they lack weapons, but because they lack humility. They begin with confidence, then comes surprise, then frustration, then denial, then escalation, then disaster. The United States has seen this pattern before. Vietnam was supposed to stop communism. Iraq was supposed to bring democracy. Afghanistan was supposed to destroy terrorism and rebuild a country. Each war began with certainty. Each war ended with far more questions than answers. For Iran could be worse because Iran is larger than Iraq, more difficult than Afghanistan in some ways, more strategically connected than Vietnam, and located at the center of the global energy system. A war there would not stay contained. It would touch oil markets, shipping lanes, global inflation, U.S. alliances, Israeli security, Saudi survival, Russian strategy, Chinese opportunity, and American domestic politics. And the most tragic part is that the opening argument would probably sound very reasonable. Stop the nuclear program, protect our allies, defend global trade, support the Iranian people, destroy terrorist networks, punish aggression. These are the kinds of phrases that make war sound clean. But war is never clean. War is not a press conference. War is not a map on a television screen. War is not a 2-week operation because someone says it will be. War is geography, blood, fear, fuel, ammunition, roads, mountains, mistakes, pride, and time. And time is what defenders often need. If Iran survives the first strike, the war changes. If American troops enter and cannot leave easily, the war changes again. If Russia warns against nuclear escalation, the war changes again. If oil markets panic, the war changes again. If US casualties rise, the war changes again. And each change makes the conflict harder to control. That is the central warning. A US war with Iran could begin as a show of strength and become a demonstration of limits. It could begin with confidence and end with exhaustion. It could begin with air superiority and end with a logistics crisis. It could begin as a campaign to reshape the Middle East and end by reshaping America's place in the world. So the question is not whether the United States has the power to attack Iran. Of course it does. The real question is whether Washington understands the difference between striking a country and defeating one. Because Iran's greatest weapon may not be a missile, a drone, or a proxy militia. Its greatest weapon may be the ability to turn American overconfidence into American entrapment. And if that happens, the war would not be remembered as another quick operation in the Middle East. It would be remembered as the moment America walked into a battlefield it could enter, but could not easily escape.